The Battle of Activism by Timothy Dixon. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are two of the most influential American civil rights activists of the 1960s. Aside from the gravity of the speeches they delivered to the nation, their participation in marches, nonprofit efforts, and use of their platforms to bring awareness to the nation's lack of anti-discriminatory policies helped many people. The most famous speeches by these two historical figures, I Have a Dream and By Any Means Necessary, expressions of outrage were finally recognized by legislators when they realized the depth of their racism in government and policies. While King and X had different approaches to racial activism, both effectively reached audiences by their tenacity and determination to bring justice to Black American communities. In Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote here, you can see he says, "I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And Malcolm X's speech says, "We declare our right on this earth to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in the society on this earth in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary." In examining contrasting impacts and theoretical framework of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and Malcolm X's By Any Means Necessary speech, it can be concluded that from provoked waves of activism and protests against racial injustice and inevitable government action, both King and X were key players in the development of civil rights during the 1960s with their use of structural literary criticism. Martin Luther King's 1964 speech, I Have a Dream, was delivered in front of thousands of viewers in Washington, D.C. He asserted that people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He equated racial injustice with quicksand and declared that the nation should be brought out of it, also asserting that it was time that the promises of democracy were realized. There would be struggling until African Americans were given equal status, according to Dr. King. And while it is not obvious, this speech is a great example of structural literary criticism because he questions the institutions that initially uphold racial bigotry. Similarly, Malcolm X's 1963 By Any Means Necessary speech demands equal treatment on the premises that all people are fundamentally equal to begin with. After slavery ended in the late 1800s, the government, although they recognized Black people as American citizens, they hardly provided like any social or economic protections or reparations at all. The University of Dayton asserted that although it finally condemned slavery and Jim Crow, it failed on both occasions to address their inequitable consequences. The federal government is reasonably held accountable for the persisting legacy of those wrongs. The government basically directed and contributed to the legacy of racist institutions and systems even after the Jim Crow era. In King and Malcolm X's speech, this is precisely what they were condemning: the inability of the government to not only provide Black Americans with the same liberty as white ones, but to even recognize the severity of their inability to alter public perception through legislation and example setting. Those who defended the social structures and institutions that upheld systemic racism were opposite of constructivists. They primarily white supremacists put said structures on a pedestal and failed to question their validity for hundreds of years. This is what King and X were essentially criticizing in their speech: the inability of racist and racist institutions to analyze why they exist in the first place. The 1960s, again, were defined by waves of activism in support of abolishing Jim Crow laws that segregated white and Black Americans. According to the Anti-Defamation League, activists worked together and used nonviolent protests and specific acts of targeted civil disobedience, such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the Greensboro Woolworth sit-ins, in order to bring about change. Much of this organizing and activism took place in the southern part of the United States. However, people from all over the country of all races and religions joined activists to proclaim their support and commitment to freedom and equality. This era of discriminatory legislation, in addition to hundreds of years of oppression, were entirely because of the lack of government regulation and acknowledgement of their racism. It seems as though Martin Luther King predicted the future of America in his famous speech. From Forbes magazine, it could be deducted that King asserted that systemic racism is the kind of invisible white supremacy that doesn't wear white hoods like some believe that it does. It is the kind that leads to the disproportionate death, illness, and economic insecurity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color we see in the wake of the pandemic today. He said that racism and activism in America isn't often blatant or well seen, but intertwined in the foundation of the country's most sacred values. Until those values are changed and dismantled from the inside out, racism and oppression will continue to thrive in society like it still does today. On the opposing side of arguments for desegregation was white supremacists who deeply valued exploiting and oppressing Black people for the benefit of their egos, industries, and social status. These people occupied government positions, small businesses, were fathers, mothers, and more. What this subculture of people failed to evolve and learn after the Civil War, however, is Black people are not disposable, less than or worthy of unfiltered hatred. This is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X fought for with their activism. They gave chances to racists to alter their point of view by peacefully protesting and civilly arguing. The government thought, or at least pretended to think, that racism and segregation would cease to exist after after the abolition of the Jim Crow laws. Desegregation was the easy part. However, and little work was done following that era to ensure anti-racism and violence against Black people. And by any means necessary, and I Have a Dream, King and X argue for African American liberties and support efforts to dismantle means of systemic discrimination. In conclusion, although both of their speeches provoked monumental protests and eventual legislative progress, the fight to end racism has not and cannot stop with the fight to end racism has not and cannot stop with government support.